Hey guys, I'm going to take us through chapter 8. It's titled Dying in Droves. And it says before dawn on January 8th, 1943, a B 24 taxied to a beachside runway on Kauai, readying for a training flight. Aboard were Superman's former co pilot, George Mosnet, and five other officers from Louis and Phil's barracks. The plane lifted off and disappeared in the darkness. After sunrise, Louie and Phil got the news the plane was missing. They rushed to Kauai and walked the beach, looking for any sign of their friends. A slip of paper washed ashore. It was a paycheck made out to Mosnet. Later that morning, the plane was found, lying on the ocean floor just offshore. All 10 crewmen were dead. The plane had barely made it past takeoff, clearing the runway, turning and slamming into the water. Several men had tried to swim the shore, but sharks had found them. The men were, Louis wrote in his diary, ripped to pieces. So this is the B-24 Stevenage II, just after being struck by flak. The plane spun several times, then exploded. The radar operator, First Lieutenant Edward Walsh Jr., was thrown from the plane and managed to open his parachute. He survived. The other crewmen were presumed dead. Louis was shaken. He'd been in Hawaii for only 2 months, yet already several dozen men from his bomb group, including 6 of the 16 men in his barracks, were dead. The first loss came on the flight from the States when a B-24 vanished. Then a plane caught fire and crashed, killing 4 men. Another plane hit a mountain, killing everyone aboard. A bomber crash-landed, killing 2. Another exploded in midair. Only 3 men survived, including one whose hand happened to be resting on a parachute when the blast flung him from the plane. A plane photographing Wake was shot down. Then Mosnet's crash. These crashes, only one caused by enemy action, weren't unusual. In World War II, some 36,000 Army Air Forces planes were lost in combat and accidents. The surprise is how many were lost in accidents. In 1943, in the region in which Louis served, for every plane lost in combat, some 6 planes were lost in accidents. In the war, almost 36,000 airmen died in non-battle situations, the vast majority in accidental crashes. Often the culprit was the planes. In January 1943 alone, Louis encountered 10 serious mechanical problems in planes in which he flew, including 2 engine failures and jammed landing gear. Once, Superman's brakes failed on landing. By the time Phil stopped the plane, it was 3 feet short of the runway's end, which abutted the ocean. And there's a B-24 that crashed on takeoff. And says, many island runways were so short that planes skimmed trees on takeoff. The tropical weather was another danger. Once, as Phil detoured around the squall, Cuppernell asked if he'd dare fly into it. "I can fly this thing anywhere," Phil said, turning into the storm. It was a near-fatal mistake. Superman was swallowed. Wind pivoted sideways and it began porpoising, swooping up and down like a swimming dolphin, leaving the men clinging to anything bolted down. They'd been at only 1,000 feet when they entered the storm. Now, with no visibility and the plane pitching wildly, they didn't know where the ocean was. Each time the plane plunged, the men braced for a crash. Oahu had been in sight a moment before, but now they'd lost all sense of its location. Pillsbury strapped on his parachute. Radio man Harry Brooks saved them. He found the signal from a Hawaiian station and determined the direction from which it was coming. Phil hauled the plane around and followed the signal home. When they landed, he was exhausted, his shirt wringing wet. Runways were another problem. Many islands were so small that coral had to be plowed onto one end to create enough length for an airstrip. Even then, runways were often too short. So many planes shot off Funafuti's runway and into the ocean that ground crews kept a bulldozer equipped with a towing cable parked by the water. For loaded B-24s, which needed well over 4,000 feet for takeoff, the cropped island runways, often abutted by towering palm trees, were a challenge. The takeoff proved exciting. wrote Staff Sergeant Frank Roseneck of one overloaded departure. The plane lumbered down the runway for an eternity, and we could see the hard-packed coral through the cracks in the bomb bay doors. There was a swoosh, and pieces of calm fronds suddenly appeared jammed in the cracks on both sides. Only the laundry knew how scared I was. Then there was human error. Pilots flew or taxied planes into each other. In B-24s notorious for fuel leaks, airmen lit cigarettes and blew up their planes. Louis was once asked to fill in on a crew, but feeling sick, he declined. On that flight, the tower warned the pilot of a mountain ahead. The pilot said he saw it, then flew right into it. On another flight, when a bomber flew sharply upward, a fallen crewman inadvertently grabbed the life raft release handle. The raft sprang from the roof and wrapped around the plane's tail. Barely able to control the plane, the pilot ordered his men to bail out. Somehow he landed and everyone survived. Finally, there was navigation. Employing a crowd of instruments, navigators groped over thousands of miles of oceans toward tiny islands that were blacked out at night and flat to the horizon. Procedures could be comically primitive. To get sextant readings, one navigator had to stand on a table and dangle out of the roof hatch while a crewman held his leg so he wouldn't be sucked out. Given how difficult navigation was, it's amazing any crews found their destinations. Many didn't. The risks of flying were compounded in combat, as planes faced enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Bunching together to fend off fighters and hit narrow target islands, planes collided, fired on each other, and worse. In one incident, as three B-24s flew together through a canyon under fire, two of them bumped. The collision sent Lieutenant Robert Strong's bomber under the plane he bumped just as that plane dropped a giant mine. The mine crashed into Strong's plane, tearing an 18-square-foot hole in the fuselage, cutting the plane nearly in two. Impossibly, Strong flew the plane 800 miles home as a gaping crack advanced up the fuselage and the tail flapped behind. Later, when a pilot pulled on the plane's tail, it nearly came off in his hand. So it says a B-24 makes its way through anti-aircraft fire. These combat risks created grim statistics. In World War II, 52,173 airmen were killed in action. A Pacific bomber crewman's tour of duty was just 40 missions. His chances of getting killed before he fulfilled it were 50%. Stricken Pacific bombers usually came down on water. Every airman had a life vest, called the Mae West after the busty movie star. Survivors had to get rafts immediately because sharks often arrived in vast numbers almost the moment planes hit. Once, coming upon a crash site, Superman's crew saw this firsthand. Hundreds of sharks, some of which looked 20 feet long, were swirling around the life rafts, on the verge of overturning them. The survivors were rescued, but the Superman crew was horrified. In 1943, Louis' USC track teammate Art Reading was knocked unconscious as he ditched his plane, landed on water. As the plane sunk, Reading's navigator, Everett Amon, pulled Reading out and lashed him to himself. As Reading woke, Amon began towing him toward the nearest island 20 miles away. Sharks began circling. One swept in, bit Amon's leg, and dove, dragging both men under. Then something gave way and the men surfaced in a pool of blood. Amon's leg had apparently been torn off. He gave his Mae West to Reading, then sank away. For 18 hours, Reading floated, kicking and hacking at attacking sharks, before a search boat found him. For good reason, sharks were feared and loathed by airmen. On one island, it was a popular pastime to lure them to jetties with bait tied to long sticks and lob grenades into their mouths. When the sharks snatched the bait, the men would watch them blow up. For downed men, the odds of rescue were very poor. Many crews went down without sending a distress call, so rescuers had no idea where they'd crashed. Often, the military didn't even learn planes were missing until they failed to land at their destinations, sometimes as long as 16 hours after the crash. To make things worse, life rafts could drift dozens of miles a day. Because of this, search areas often extended over thousands of square miles. If searchers did fly near a raft, they likely wouldn't see it. Those search planes generally flew at just 1,000 feet, even from that height. rafts could be mistaken for whitecaps. To avoid stalling, many rescue planes had to be flown so fast that crewmen only had a moment to scan each area before it was gone. The sad truth known to Louis, Phil, and all other airmen was that the vast majority of downed men were never found. The improbability of rescue, coupled with the soaring rate of accidental crashes, created a terrible equation. Search planes appear to have been more likely to go down themselves than to find the men they were looking for. It's likely that for every man rescued, several would-be rescuers died. Hunger, thirst, and exposure depleted raft-bound men with frightening rapidity. Some died in days. Others went insane. In 1942, a bomber crashed in the Pacific, stranding 9 men on a raft. Within a few days, one had died, and the rest had gone mad. 2 heard music and baying dogs. 2 scuffled over an imaginary case of beer. Another shouted curses at a sky he believed was full of bombers. Seeing a boat that wasn't there, he leapt overboard and drowned. When the men were rescued on day 7, they were too weak to wave their arms. Of all the horrors facing downed men, the one most feared was captured by the Japanese. The roots of this fear lay in an event that occurred in 1937, early in Japan's invasion of China. The Japanese military surrounded the city of Nanking, stranding civilians and 90,000 Chinese soldiers, who surrendered. Japanese officers then issued an order to execute all POWs. What followed was a 6-week frenzy of killing. POWs were beheaded, machine-gunned, bayoneted, and burned alive. The Japanese turned on civilians, staging killing contests, raping tens of thousands of people, mutilating and crucifying them. The Japanese press ran tallies of killing contests, praising the contestants. Historians estimate that the Japanese murdered between 200,000 and 430,000 Chinese, including the 90,000 POWs, in what became known as the Rape of Nanking. Every airman knew about Nanking, and since then Japan had reinforced the precedent. In Louis' squadron there was a rumor that on Japanese territory in the Marshall Islands called Kwajalein, POWs were murdered. The men called it Execution Island. It is testament to the reputation of the Japanese that in one doomed B-24 falling over Japanese forces, only one man bailed out. The rest were so afraid of capture that they chose to die in the crash. For airmen, the risk couldn't be ignored. The dead were their roommates, their friends, the crew flying off their wing 10 seconds ago. Men didn't die one by one. A quarter of barracks perished at once. There were rarely funerals, for there were rarely bodies. Airmen didn't speak of death, but privately many were tormented by fear. Before Louis had left the States, he'd been issued a Bible. He tried reading it to soothe his anxiety, but it made no sense to him. He often left Phil sprawled on his bed, penning love letters to Cece, as he ran off his worries on the mile course he'd measured around the runway. He also tried to prepare for every contingency, even taking an elderly Hawaiian seminar on fending off sharks. Open eyes wide, bare teeth, bop shark in the nose. Phil carried 2 good luck charms. One was a bracelet Cece had given him. Believing it protected him, he wouldn't fly without it. The other was a silver dollar. When he finally ran away with Cece, he said he'd use it to tip the bellboy. When I do get home, he wrote to her, I'm going to hide you where no one will find us. As Oahu's airmen died in droves, a ritual began. When a man was lost, his friends would open his footlocker, take out his liquor, and have a drink in his honor. In a war without funerals, it was the best they could do.